For centuries, Britain's power at sea was admired, feared, and rarely questioned. Yet the methods behind that dominance were far more calculated than most histories admit. Stay with this story to understand how quiet decisions made far from the battlefield shaped victories, losses, and a legacy that still echoes across the oceans. Few people realize that Britain's greatest naval victories often began long before the first cannon was fired. Britain's rise as a maritime power is usually described as inevitable, almost natural, as if the sea itself favored the island nation. Generations grew up hearing that discipline, courage, and superior seamanship carried British fleets to victory. This version of history is comforting and simple, and it allows listeners to relax into familiar conclusions without questioning how fragile survival at sea truly was. In reality, Britain's dependence on the ocean created constant vulnerability rather than confidence. Food, trade, and communication all moved by water, and a single failure at sea could threaten the entire state. Naval strength was not a matter of pride alone. It was a condition for survival. Admirals understood that losing control of the sea, even briefly, could mean invasion, starvation, or economic collapse. This pressure shaped decisions in quiet rooms far from the sound of waves. Naval planners did not think in terms of honorable contests or balanced engagements. They thought in terms of preventing disaster at any cost. When survival is at stake, restraint becomes a luxury, and this reality sat beneath every order issued from London to the fleet. Popular memory focuses on famous battles and heroic names, yet these moments were outcomes rather than causes. Long before ships met, British commanders asked difficult questions about how wars at sea were actually decided. They examined not only victories, but how enemies broke, withdrew, or simply vanished from the fight altogether. These patterns mattered more than dramatic clashes. For listeners who value clarity and calm explanation, this is where understanding begins. Naval warfare was slow, uncertain, and deeply psychological. Weeks could pass without contact, and then everything could end in minutes. Decisions made in isolation carried consequences that could not be corrected once sails were set and coastlines disappeared. Britain's leaders recognized that waiting for fair engagements was dangerous. The sea did not reward patience. It rewarded initiative, surprise, and the ability to impose fear at moments when the enemy felt safest. This understanding did not emerge overnight, nor was it openly celebrated. It developed quietly, shaped by experience and loss. Many sailors never knew why certain orders were given. They followed signals and routines without seeing the wider calculations behind them. This distance between decision and consequence created a system where responsibility felt abstract even as lives were placed at risk. For an audience that listens thoughtfully, this separation explains much about how extreme choices became acceptable. The image of naval glory often hides the reality that success at sea demanded emotional detachment. Ships were expensive, crews were replaceable, and outcomes were measured in control rather than compassion. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but a cold response to an unforgiving environment where hesitation could doom thousands ashore. Britain's naval story, when viewed honestly, is less about triumph and more about prevention. The aim was not simply to win battles, but to make certain battles never happened again. Achieving that goal required methods that worked consistently, even if they were uncomfortable to acknowledge later. As this understanding settled into British thinking, the nature of naval power quietly changed, setting the stage for decisions that would redefine warfare at sea. Few realized that fighting at sea demanded a mindset entirely different from land warfare. Naval combat existed within a world of isolation, where vast distances separated fleets and communication was slow and unreliable. Commanders could not rely on immediate reports or reinforcements. A misjudged maneuver might only be discovered hours or even days later. This reality shaped every decision, demanding patience, foresight, and a careful weighing of risk against reward. Unlike land engagements, where generals could survey the battlefield in person, the sea concealed much, and success often depended on anticipating the enemy's reactions without ever seeing them. Listeners attuned to strategy will recognize that this was a domain where mental discipline was as critical as physical prowess. Every commander understood that weather, tides, and visibility were silent partners in war. A sudden storm could scatter ships, while fog or darkness offered both opportunity and danger. It was not simply a matter of positioning ships to fire upon one another. It was about predicting the environment and shaping it to one's advantage. Listeners who value calm and clear explanation can appreciate that naval dominance required the careful orchestration of many variables simultaneously, each carrying profound consequences for crew and vessel alike. Distance at sea created a unique form of psychological tension. Sailors often remained unaware of their ultimate objective or the scale of an approaching battle until the last moment. For officers, this uncertainty required projecting confidence, maintaining discipline, and conveying orders that had to function without immediate clarification. This created an emotional detachment, where the weight of life and death decisions rested in theory more than in immediate observation. Thoughtful listeners can sense how such a system fostered a mixture of obedience, anxiety, and reliance on planning. The isolation also encouraged innovation. British naval commanders developed signaling systems, formations, and contingency plans designed to function across miles of open water. They understood that slow communication demanded redundancy and clarity, and that any misinterpretation could result in disaster. These practices were not merely tactical. They reflected a deep understanding of human psychology and the limits of perception. For an audience attuned to strategy, it becomes clear that such measures were quietly revolutionary in their time, yet often underappreciated in standard narratives. At the same time, the sea amplified consequences. A misjudged attack could leave ships vulnerable to counterstrike or environmental hazards. Unlike a land army, retreating vessels could be cut off entirely, lost to storms, or overtaken by more agile forces. For the listeners, this underscores that every order issued by a British commander carried amplified stakes, where hesitation or overconfidence might imperil thousands, and small advantages could produce outsized effects. This environment also shaped the moral framework of naval conduct. Commanders learned that cruelty and calculation were often inseparable. To dominate an adversary, fear could be wielded strategically, morale targeted indirectly, and decisive strikes timed to maximize psychological disruption. Sailors might not have understood the reasoning, yet they experienced the results. Attentive listeners can perceive how these choices balanced necessity with strategy, forming an underlying logic that differed markedly from land-based warfare. Naval operations further depended on predicting enemy behavior over extended periods. Fleet positioning, supply management, and timing of engagements required decisions that would only bear fruit far from the immediate scene. Such foresight demanded a patient, analytical approach, emphasizing outcomes rather than appearances. Listeners who favor reasoned storytelling will find this methodical style compelling, as it highlights deliberate planning rather than spectacle. Even the simplest movements carry profound implications. Crossing a strait, blockading a port, or dispatching a squadron was never routine. Each action was part of a web of constraints and possibilities, where environmental, logistical, and human factors intersected. Understanding these dynamics allows listeners to appreciate the complexity of British naval success beyond myths of luck or innate superiority. The combination of isolation, environmental uncertainty, psychological tension, and moral calculation produced a form of warfare uniquely suited to British strategic thinking. Those who endured it were tested not only in skill, but in patience, judgment, and resilience. By examining the mental and operational framework of these commanders, listeners gain insight into how methodical decisions at sea determined the fate of nations. Understanding these elements sets the stage for revealing how the British transformed these conditions into deliberate, calculated methods that consistently shaped outcomes in their favor. Every decision at sea carried echoes beyond immediate sight, quietly determining the course of battles and shaping the enduring legacy of British maritime power. Few outside the study of naval history realize how much of Britain's success at sea relied on subtle manipulation rather than sheer firepower. By the 18th and 19th centuries, British commanders had discovered that controlling the mind of an opponent could be as decisive as controlling the waves themselves. This was not about cruelty for its own sake, but about shaping outcomes efficiently and reliably. Fear, uncertainty, and hesitation became tools of strategy, used to achieve objectives without unnecessary exposure or loss. For the audience who appreciates careful reasoning and calm narrative, this approach reframes what naval dominance truly required, not only ships and guns, but psychological acuity and careful timing. Commanders observed that enemies often faltered in predictable ways. Ships separated from their squadrons, inexperienced officers misread signals, and crews panicked under sudden stress. British strategists began to study these patterns, noting when an aggressive maneuver might cause a fleet to scatter without a direct clash, or how the threat of engagement could compel retreat. Listeners attuned to subtle strategy can sense the meticulous calculation behind these actions, where each move was intended to provoke a specific reaction rather than merely to inflict damage. The use of fear extended to timing and positioning. British forces would sometimes withhold attack until the enemy was most vulnerable, or create apparent opportunities for their opponents to make mistakes. Knowledge of winds, tides, and currents allowed commanders to anticipate where adversaries might be forced into disadvantageous positions. Every choice, from the deployment of a squadron to the angle of approach, was informed by an understanding of human behavior as well as environmental conditions. Thoughtful listeners can appreciate that this strategy required patience, discipline, and long-term observation, qualities often overlooked in conventional narratives of combat. At the same time, these psychological tactics were codified slowly and carefully. Admirals and captains discussed experiences, shared lessons learned, and formalized procedures for signaling, engagement, and pursuit. The result was a system where fear became predictable and controllable, applied strategically to achieve objectives with minimal risk. Audiences interested in measured, reasoned storytelling can perceive how this methodical approach turned intuition into doctrine and individual insight into collective practice. These methods also shaped the moral and ethical landscape of naval warfare. British leaders understood that decisive action could require choices that were uncomfortable or morally ambiguous. Captains had to balance the immediate risk to their crews against the potential collapse of an opposing fleet. The necessity of achieving objectives with precision meant that restraint was often secondary to effectiveness. For listeners who value clarity and authority in narrative, this demonstrates that strategy at sea was never about spectacle, but about the careful management of consequences. Another dimension was the unpredictability of human response. Even when tactics were applied correctly, outcomes could vary, and commanders remained vigilant for signs of hesitation or panic. Observation became continuous and decision-making adaptive. The audience can feel the quiet tension of this system, understanding that naval supremacy relied on constant assessment and the disciplined exploitation of subtle weaknesses. The application of psychological pressure also extended beyond immediate combat. Blockades, feints, and displays of readiness all communicated threats and shaped adversary decisions before direct engagement occurred. British commanders recognized that by controlling perception, they could limit the need for costly battles while maintaining strategic advantage. For listeners, this emphasizes the intellectual dimension of maritime power, where victory was engineered through understanding rather than brute force alone. Through these strategies, Britain transformed the unpredictable environment of the sea into a domain of calculated influence. Commanders learned to read opponents, exploit situational advantages, and manipulate outcomes with minimal expenditure of resources. The combination of careful planning, environmental awareness, and psychological insight produced a model of naval warfare that was quietly lethal and consistently effective. By considering how fear was applied as a tool rather than a byproduct, listeners can begin to see the full sophistication behind British naval dominance. These tactics were not obvious and they were rarely celebrated, but they formed the foundation for success that extended far beyond individual battles. The careful orchestration of uncertainty, anticipation, and influence ensured that Britain's fleets could dictate the terms of engagement long before cannons were fired, quietly shaping the course of history in ways that would remain largely invisible to contemporaries and casual observers alike. Few strategies proved as transformative for Britain's navy as the process of turning individual decisions into formal doctrine. Commanders who discovered effective techniques did not simply rely on instinct. They recognized that consistency and replication were essential. A method that worked once in a single battle could not be counted on to secure future victories unless it became part of a system understood by every officer and crew member. This required careful observation, meticulous recording of outcomes, and deliberate teaching. For listeners who value calm, reasoned exposition, it becomes clear that naval dominance was as much about process as about courage or firepower. These practices were institutionalized gradually. Admirals evaluated successes and failures, noting which maneuvers produced predictable results, which signaling protocols prevented confusion, and which formations allowed maximum flexibility. Over time, lessons learned in isolated engagements evolved into standardized orders, manuals, and training routines. Audiences attuned to structured, thoughtful storytelling can perceive how a collection of individual insights became a shared framework, allowing fleets to operate with remarkable efficiency and coherence. The codification of tactics also reflected a pragmatic approach to human behavior. Commanders understood that fear, anticipation, and obedience could be shaped systematically. By establishing clear procedures, they reduced uncertainty and ensured that crews responded predictably under stress. The result was not merely improved coordination, it was the creation of a culture in which decisions that might have been considered extreme in isolation became normalized through repetition and institutional support. Listeners who appreciate methodical reasoning will sense how this system produced both reliability and subtle psychological influence. Standardized doctrine also affected logistics and long-term planning. Fleet movements, supply chains, and timing of engagements were all coordinated to function according to established principles. This allowed admirals to manage complex operations across great distances and to anticipate the likely consequences of enemy actions. The careful integration of planning, tactics, and human behavior gave Britain an operational advantage that extended far beyond individual battles. For those listening attentively, it demonstrates that success was built on foresight, patience, and cumulative knowledge rather than sheer force alone. Moreover, the formalization of methods shaped career trajectories and command decisions. Captains were trained to recognize specific scenarios and respond according to proven techniques. Innovation was encouraged only within a framework that ensured predictability. For the audience focused on decision-driven storytelling, this highlights the tension between initiative and control, illustrating how extreme outcomes were achieved, not by improvisation, but by disciplined application of established practices. The process also allowed Britain to maintain consistency in widely varying conditions. Weather, terrain, and enemy behavior differed from engagement to engagement, yet standardized approaches allowed fleets to respond adaptively while remaining coordinated. Observant listeners can appreciate that doctrine was not rigid. It functioned as a guide that transformed complex, uncertain environments into manageable operational contexts, preserving strategic intent across diverse situations. As these methods became ingrained, the moral dimension of command was subtly altered. Decisions that might once have seemed harsh were justified by their inclusion within an accepted system of operational procedure. This did not remove the human cost, but it did provide a framework for applying extreme measures in a controlled, intentional manner. For audiences seeking calm and authoritative explanation, it becomes apparent that doctrine served both practical and psychological purposes. The adoption of doctrine also enhanced communication. Standardized signaling, formation, and engagement practices reduced errors and ambiguity, allowing larger fleets to operate in concert. This coordination enabled complex maneuvers and surprise tactics that might have been impossible without a shared understanding. Listeners can perceive how efficiency, control, and subtle psychological impact were interwoven, producing a cumulative advantage over less organized adversaries. Through the codification of successful methods, Britain transformed isolated innovations into systemic capability. The careful blending of observation, instruction, and institutionalization ensured that effective tactics were no longer dependent on individual genius alone, but became part of a resilient, replicable model for naval warfare. The meticulous structuring of command, doctrine, and behavior prepared the Navy to act with precision and confidence, quietly magnifying the impact of every decision while maintaining a steady, methodical rhythm of operation that would define British naval power for generations. Few aspects of Britain's naval dominance were as consequential as the human experience beneath the strategy. For sailors and junior officers, the systems, doctrines, and calculated tactics described earlier translated into long hours of uncertainty, discipline, and exposure to constant risk. Life aboard a warship was not merely physical labor. It was an exercise in endurance, patience, and psychological resilience. Crews operated under the weight of decisions made far above their decks, and yet those decisions determined the difference between survival and disaster. Listeners who value calm and clear narration can sense how the same methods that ensured operational success also imposed profound burdens on individuals. The isolation of the sea magnified every consequence. Sailors spent weeks or months at sea, often without sight of land or knowledge of friendly or enemy movements. Supplies were finite, and mistakes carried immediate repercussions. Even the most disciplined crew could find themselves in sudden danger if weather, navigation, or enemy action disrupted expectations. These conditions required a steadfast attention to procedure and an ability to respond without hesitation. For the audience, this conveys the quiet weight of responsibility and the continuous tension that defined daily life aboard British ships. Commanders' use of calculated fear added another layer of complexity. Tactics that relied on inducing hesitation, confusion, or panic in the enemy also affected Allied crews. Sailors learned to anticipate sudden maneuvers, unexpected signals, and rapid deployments. The discipline necessary to act effectively under these circumstances created a climate of focus and attentiveness. Thoughtful listeners will recognize how the strategic manipulation of human behavior extended downward through the chain of command, shaping the lived experience of every individual aboard. The constant presence of risk demanded mental resilience. Sailors had to maintain composure during extended periods of waiting when the threat might be present but invisible. This psychological training was subtle and gradual, emerging from routines, drills, and the careful enforcement of naval protocol. For listeners attuned to reflective storytelling, it becomes clear that much of British success was predicated on the cultivation of a mindset capable of enduring prolonged uncertainty without breakdown. These pressures also influenced the culture aboard ships. Respect for procedure, awareness of hierarchy, and attention to minute details were essential. A single error could compromise an entire maneuver or jeopardize lives. Listeners who enjoy calm and deliberate narration can appreciate that these routines were not arbitrary, but carefully designed to reinforce reliability and minimize risk in an environment where the margin for error was vanishingly small. The human cost extended beyond discipline and focus. Exposure to harsh weather, limited nutrition, and cramped conditions tested endurance continuously. While doctrine and strategy sought to manage outcomes, they could not shield sailors from the physical realities of maritime warfare. Listeners gain an appreciation for the interplay between strategic precision and human vulnerability, understanding that every decision made at the top rippled outward, shaping the experience of those who executed it. Even victories carried hidden burdens. Success required adherence to methods that sometimes felt severe or uncompromising. Crews endured these measures because they were effective, not because they were pleasant. The audience can sense that discipline, patience, and controlled obedience were instruments of both survival and tactical advantage, producing a complex mix of satisfaction, relief, and exhaustion. The integration of human factors into strategic planning also highlights the sophistication of British naval operations. Commanders did not treat their sailors as interchangeable parts. They studied responses, anticipated weaknesses, and designed routines that maximized effectiveness while minimizing chaos. For the audience, this emphasizes that operational success relied as much on understanding human nature as on understanding wind, tide, and cannon. By considering the experiences of those on the front lines of strategy, listeners can grasp the full consequences of calculated tactics. The combination of isolation, discipline, exposure, and psychological demand created a reality in which human resilience became a central factor in victory. Every sailor's endurance, awareness, and responsiveness contributed to the broader outcomes, quietly shaping the effectiveness of British naval power while illustrating the profound costs embedded within what appeared, from a distance, to be orderly and controlled maritime dominance. Even as doctrines and strategies dictated action, it was the human element that determined whether these calculated measures would succeed or falter. Few achievements in military history were as carefully measured as Britain's sustained control of the seas. By the time naval operations reached their full maturity, the combination of strategy, doctrine, and human discipline had created a system capable of projecting power across vast distances with remarkable consistency. Every decision, from the positioning of squadrons to the timing of attacks, had been informed by decades of observation, experience, and careful refinement. Listeners attuned to thoughtful storytelling can perceive that such success was neither accidental nor the result of brute force alone, but the product of deliberate, methodical orchestration. The effectiveness of these measures became most apparent in the outcomes they produced. Enemy fleets were often neutralized before engagement through careful anticipation and the subtle application of pressure. Even when direct confrontation occurred, British forces relied on established procedures and disciplined crews to maintain initiative and exploit weaknesses. Audiences who appreciate calm exposition can sense how controlled application of doctrine ensured that victories were reliable rather than lucky, and that results reinforced the broader strategy of maritime dominance. At the same time, the moral and human dimensions of this power remained ever present. Commanders were acutely aware of the lives entrusted to their decisions and the ethical implications of calculated measures that might place individuals at risk. Maintaining a balance between operational necessity and human welfare required constant judgment, and listeners who value reflective insight can appreciate the weight of responsibility that underpinned every order and maneuver. The quiet deliberation of leadership becomes central to understanding how outcomes were achieved without unnecessary loss, even when the cost was still significant. This sustained dominance also had strategic consequences far beyond individual battles. Control of sea lanes allowed Britain to protect trade, maintain communication, and support distant colonies. It enabled the projection of influence without the constant need for large-scale land campaigns, creating a form of power that was efficient and enduring. For the audience, this illustrates that maritime supremacy was as much about maintaining stability and preventing threats as it was about achieving spectacular victories. The integration of psychological insight, rigorous doctrine, and human discipline produced a cumulative advantage. Adversaries faced not just ships and guns, but a system that anticipated responses, exploited weaknesses, and applied pressure in a controlled, effective manner. Listeners can perceive the elegance of this system, where careful orchestration replaced chaos and strategic intent, guided every action, shaping the broader arc of history with measured precision. Reflecting on this legacy, it becomes evident that Britain's naval supremacy was a product of foresight as much as force. The methods developed and refined over generations allowed fleets to act with confidence, coherence, and adaptability. Every engagement, routine operation, and strategic decision reinforced the broader framework, creating a resilient and replicable model of maritime power. Audiences attuned to calm, analytical narration can understand that these achievements were sustained not by chance, but by consistent application of tested principles. Even as the seas remained unpredictable, the British Navy's disciplined approach ensured that uncertainty was managed rather than feared. Decisions were guided by knowledge of the environment, careful anticipation of enemy behavior, and a clear understanding of human factors. For listeners, this demonstrates that mastery of the maritime domain was intellectual as well as practical, relying on reasoning, observation, and experience to secure lasting outcomes. In examining these elements, It becomes clear that the enduring influence of Britain's naval methods extended far beyond the immediate moment of conflict. The systems, strategies, and disciplined execution established a model that informed future generations, shaping doctrines and practices in navies around the world. For the audience, this provides a sense of continuity, revealing that the quiet, deliberate work of planners and sailors alike left a legacy that endured long after individual battles ended. Ultimately, Britain's dominance at sea illustrates how deliberate decision-making, careful planning, and the disciplined application of knowledge can transform vulnerability into enduring strength. By combining strategic insight with human resilience, the Navy created a form of control that was both effective and sustainable, securing influence across the oceans and establishing a standard of operational excellence that would be studied for centuries.